When Aisha Rahman first stepped into the glass towers of Linton and Marks, one of the city's most prestigious marketing firms, she carried more than just a folder of qualifications and references. She carried her father's dreams, her mother's prayers, and the heavy weight of expectation that came with being a first-generation immigrant. The office was bright, buzzing, filled with polished professionals in tailored suits. Their laughter rang through the halls like music, confident, effortless, belonging. Aisha smiled nervously as she entered, clutching her employee badge like a lifeline. Her resume was flawless. She had graduated top of her class, earned an MBA on scholarship, and had been praised by professors for her creativity and leadership. But all it took was a single word, spoken in her soft South Asian accent, for the tone in the room to shift. It happened on her first day, during introductions. She introduced herself politely, her voice steady but tinged with that unmistakable lilt of her homeland. The others exchanged glances, smirking quietly behind polite smiles. Someone chuckled under their breath, thinking she couldn't hear. From that moment, she was no longer just Aisha, the new junior analyst. She became the girl with the accent. Every meeting seemed to test her in ways others never faced. When she presented ideas, they were met with silence or condescending nods. Minutes later, when a colleague repeated the same point in an American accent, everyone suddenly loved it. When she spoke on conference calls, people interrupted her, pretending they couldn't understand. "Sorry, could you repeat that?" became a weapon disguised as politeness. The jokes followed, too. Whispered imitations when they thought she wasn't listening. Mocking comments about her, call, center voice. Aisha laughed them off at first, forcing herself to believe they were harmless. But deep down, every jab cut deeper than the last. She stayed late most nights rechecking her work over, preparing for presentations, trying desperately to prove herself. But no matter how much effort she put in, she was always good for someone with her background. There was one incident she would never forget. During a major client meeting, she had been given a small section to present. She practiced for hours, perfecting every word. But when the time came, her manager, a sharp, arrogant man named Chris, accidentally skipped over her slides. He told her afterward that he thought her voice might confuse the clients. That night, she sat in her car in the company parking lot long after everyone had left. Tears blurred the city lights outside her window. She thought of her father, who had sold his small shop back home so she could study abroad. She thought of her mother's hands, roughened by years of labor, clasped together in prayer for her success. She couldn't go back. Not like this. Aisha promised herself that she wouldn't let them break her. If her accent made her different, then she would make that difference her strength. She would let her work, not her words, speak for her. But the months ahead would test her more than she ever imagined. The laughter behind her back would grow louder. The opportunities would shrink smaller. And one day, a betrayal inside those very walls would push her to the edge, forcing her to make a choice that would change everything. As winter set in, the company prepared for its biggest project of the year, a campaign that could redefine careers. Aisha saw her chance to finally prove herself. She worked nights and weekends, crafting ideas so original that they could not be ignored. But not everyone was ready to let her shine. Because in a world where accents were mocked and roots were ridiculed, some people would do anything to keep her beneath them. And soon, Aisha would learn that in order to rise, she'd have to stop seeking acceptance and start commanding respect. The following months at Linton and Marks blurred together in a haze of overwork and quiet humiliation. Aisha learned to hide her frustration behind professional smiles and calm nods. She stopped volunteering ideas in meetings, choosing instead to email her suggestions afterward, where her words, not her accent, could speak for her. But the bias was always there, subtle yet cutting. She noticed how colleagues who joined after her were promoted faster. She saw how her ideas were borrowed, polished, and presented by others who took full credit. The office that had once felt like a dream opportunity now felt like a polished cage. Yet, through it all, Aisha didn't give up. Every late night at her desk was an act of quiet rebellion. Every report she perfected, every campaign she improved, every client she impressed. It was her way of saying, "You can mock my voice, but you cannot silence me." Then came the Aurora campaign, the biggest project of the year. The client was a major international brand preparing to launch a new product across markets in Asia and Europe. The company's leadership made it clear, Whoever led this campaign successfully would be in line for a major promotion. Aisha saw her chance. This was her moment to prove that talent knew no accent. Chris, her manager, assigned tasks with his usual arrogance, but Aisha could tell he underestimated her. He put her in charge of cultural insight, essentially, research into Asian consumer behavior, an assignment he clearly considered secondary. But Aisha knew that understanding people was the soul of marketing. She dove into her work, conducting detailed surveys, analyzing cultural trends, and identifying emotional connections that could make the campaign resonate globally. Her findings were powerful, authentic, human, and deeply relevant. She crafted a presentation that tied cultural nuance with modern branding in a way no one in the office had ever done before. When the day of the internal review came, Aisha felt a rare spark of confidence. As she presented her ideas, a few colleagues exchanged glances. But this time, their smirks faded as her data and insights unfolded. Even Chris looked momentarily impressed. But success breeds envy, and envy breeds betrayal. A week later, Aisha walked into the office early, only to find the conference room lights on. Through the glass, she saw Chris rehearsing a presentation. Her presentation. The same slides, the same research, the same insights. He had replaced her name with his. Her chest tightened as she stood frozen outside the door. The betrayal was complete. Everything she had worked for, every sleepless night, was about to be stolen from her again. The client presentation was scheduled for the next day. Aisha debated whether to confront him, to go to HR to fight. But she knew how these stories ended. The immigrant woman with the thick accent, accusing her white male manager of stealing her work. No one would believe her. They never did. That night, she made a decision. Not out of anger, but out of resolve. If they wanted to take credit for her work, then she would make sure the world knew whose ideas had truly shaped that campaign. The next morning, she walked into the office with quiet determination. She noticed Chris standing confidently at the head of the table, rehearsing one last time before the clients arrived. When the presentation began, everything went smoothly. He delivered her words with his own voice, smiling smugly at the applause. But then the questions began. One of the clients, an executive from Tokyo, asked for detailed explanations about the cultural data sources. Chris hesitated. He fumbled. He tried to gloss over the question, but the client pressed further. The other executives turned to him expectantly, and that's when Aisha spoke up, calmly, confidently, explaining the data, the cultural implications, and the emotional reasoning behind each strategy. Her accent filled the room, steady, eloquent, and sure. By the time she finished, the clients were nodding, visibly impressed. The lead client smiled, thanking her for her insightful presentation. Chris's expression hardened, his confidence crumbling. Everyone in the room saw what had just happened, who the true strategist was. After the meeting, Chris avoided her gaze. He knew he had been exposed, but he also knew that humiliation in front of the team would only make him more dangerous. Over the next few days, he became cold, distant. He stopped copying her on emails, excluded her from key meetings, and reassigned her projects. The message was clear. She had embarrassed him, and now she would pay for it. Still, Aisha refused to bend. Her quiet strength was beginning to draw attention from unexpected places. A senior executive from another department, someone who had witnessed the meeting, began taking note of her work. She started receiving invitations to cross-departmental collaborations. But before her progress could solidify, Chris struck again. This time with something far worse. A report was filed against Aisha for professional misconduct, claiming she had shared confidential company data with outside parties. The accusation was false, but in the corporate world, perception was often more powerful than truth. HR launched an investigation. She was suspended pending review. Aisha sat in the empty conference room, staring at the notice in her trembling hands. Everything she had built, everything she had sacrificed, was collapsing. Her dream was slipping through her fingers, not because she wasn't good enough, but because she had dared to be visible. As she left the office for what might be the last time, her badge flashing red at the scanner, she made one final promise to herself. If they thought they could silence her voice forever, they hadn't heard her roar yet. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest in Aisha's life. The suspension from Linton and Marks hit harder than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just the loss of income or career progress. It was the humiliation, the whispered rumors among co-workers, the pitying glances, The sudden silence in group chats that used to buzz with work updates. Overnight, Aisha went from being a promising analyst to the office's newest cautionary tale. Her phone barely rang anymore. Emails went unanswered. And the worst part, she had no way to defend herself. The investigation was confidential, HR said. No details could be discussed. She knew Chris had orchestrated it all, forged connections, twisted half-truths, and weaponized company bureaucracy. But proving it would be almost impossible. Aisha's father called every evening, asking if she was eating properly, if she was okay. She lied, saying work was busy, pretending that everything was fine. She couldn't bear to let her parents know that the daughter they'd sacrificed everything for was being torn apart by prejudice disguised as professionalism. She spent her days trapped in a cycle of anger and despair. Some nights, she would replay every moment in her head, every insult, every smirk, every time she'd been told to slow down or speak clearly. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Her real mistake wasn't being too bold or too naive. It was believing that excellence alone could erase bias. After nearly 2 months, she received the official email from HR. The investigation had found evidence of negligence, a vague, hollow justification for what was clearly a setup. Her employment was terminated, effective immediately. The world fell silent. She stared at the screen for a long time, her hands trembling. She thought of everything she had endured for this job, how she had built her life around it, how it had defined her worth. And in one cold sentence, it was gone. For a week, she barely left her apartment. The walls felt smaller with each passing day. Rejection emails piled up as she applied to new jobs. No one wanted to hire someone, terminated for misconduct. Then, one night, while scrolling through LinkedIn, she stumbled upon a post from Linton and Marks. They were celebrating the success of the Aurora campaign. Her work. The post credited Chris Lambert and his exceptional team for the breakthrough. There were comments praising his leadership, his innovation. Something inside Aisha broke, but not in the way she expected. It wasn't despair this time. It was fire. For weeks, she had cried, questioned herself, doubted her worth. But seeing her stolen work glorified in front of the world awakened something deeper. She realized that as long as she kept fighting for validation from those who saw her as less, she would always lose. She didn't need their approval. She needed her own vision. Aisha made a decision that night. If no company would hire her, she would build her own. She started small, working from her tiny apartment, using the laptop she had bought as a student. She named her company Aurora Strategies, reclaiming the name of the campaign they'd stolen from her. It was poetic, almost symbolic. At first, she struggled. Clients were skeptical. Some didn't take her seriously when they heard her accent over the phone. Others backed out after learning she didn't have a big office or a corporate name behind her. But Aisha kept pushing. She built a website, began sharing her ideas online, and slowly, through sheer persistence, people started noticing. Her strategies were sharp, culturally nuanced, and emotionally intelligent. Small businesses reached out, then mid-sized ones. Each project led to another. Her reputation began to grow. Within a year, Aurora Strategies had its first major client, a regional fashion brand looking to expand internationally. Aisha poured everything into that project. The campaign went viral, praised for its authenticity and inclusivity. The success opened doors she never knew existed. By the second year, her small company had grown into a real agency. She hired a few trusted freelancers, most of them people who had also been marginalized or underestimated in the corporate world. Together, they created a new kind of workplace, one that valued talent over titles, voices over accents. But destiny wasn't done writing her story. One morning, as Aisha scrolled through her emails, she froze. It was from a global conglomerate seeking a marketing partner for an international rebranding campaign. The name attached to the proposal stunned her, Linton and Marks. The very company that had fired her, mocked her, and stolen her ideas now wanted to hire her agency as their consultant. Her pulse quickened. The proposal requested a meeting with the CEO of Aurora Strategies. They had no idea who that was. Aisha leaned back in her chair, the faintest smile forming on her lips. The same accent they had laughed at would soon be the voice giving them their next direction. But she didn't rush. She wanted to play this right, not for revenge, but for justice. Because sometimes the sweetest form of revenge isn't humiliation. It's success so undeniable that even your enemies have no choice but to applaud. The day of the meeting arrived like a ghost from the past. Aisha stood before the mirror in her office, adjusting her navy blazer, the same color as the one she'd worn on her first day at Linton and Marks, though everything else about her had changed. The timid young woman who once trembled at whispered jokes was gone. In her place stood a leader, composed and confident, her posture straight, her eyes steady, her voice, the same voice they once mocked, now her greatest weapon. Aurora Strategies had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. The agency had won multiple awards, expanded internationally, and built a reputation for campaigns that didn't just sell products. They told stories, united cultures, and sparked movements. And at the center of it all was Aisha Rahman, the immigrant woman with the accent that had once been called "or professional." When her assistant informed her that the representatives from Linton and Marks had arrived, she took a deep breath, allowing herself one moment of reflection. Then she stepped out of her office. The meeting room was spacious, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed everything in morning light. 3 people waited inside. The first, a young executive with nervous energy. The second, a marketing director who smiled professionally. And the third, sitting at the head of the table, confident as ever, was Chris Lambert. Aisha's heartbeat slowed as she saw him. Time had aged him slightly, but the arrogance was still there, like an old perfume clinging to faded clothes. He didn't recognize her at first. When her assistant introduced her as Dagger, Aisha Rahman, CEO and founder of Aurora Strategies, Chris's expression faltered for just a moment, a flicker of disbelief, before he quickly composed himself. It took everything in Aisha not to let a smile slip. The presentation began, but this time it was Aisha leading the room. Her voice filled the space, calm, eloquent, and precise. Every word carried the weight of experience, every pause radiated control. The same accent that once made them laugh now commanded silence. Chris shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as she effortlessly articulated ideas that soared above anything his team could match. The tables had turned and everyone knew it. When the presentation ended, the board members from Linton and Marks were visibly impressed. They praised Aurora's vision, noting how perfectly it aligned with their global goals. A contract was discussed, timelines reviewed, and before the meeting ended, they officially requested to work with Aisha's firm. As they stood to leave, Chris lingered behind, his eyes flicking toward her with a mixture of recognition and regret. He finally remembered the woman he had once humiliated, the one he'd pushed out of the company. Now she was the one signing contracts he would have to deliver on. That evening, as the office emptied and the city lights glowed beyond her window, Aisha sat quietly at her desk. She could have gloated. She could have humiliated him the way he had humiliated her. But that wasn't who she was anymore. Success had changed her, but not in the way people expected. It hadn't hardened her. It had refined her. The laughter that once burned her now only reminded her how far she'd come. Still, the next phase of this journey was about more than revenge. It was about impact. Aisha knew there were countless others like her. People overlooked, ridiculed, and silenced simply because they spoke differently, dressed differently, or came from another place. She wanted Aurora Strategies to become a beacon for them, a place where voices the world tried to ignore could be amplified. In the weeks that followed, the partnership between Aurora and Linton and Marks began. Meetings were scheduled, strategies drafted, and budgets approved. Chris found himself reporting to Aisha more than once. Each interaction was polite, professional, and painfully humbling for him. But Aisha noticed something else too, a quiet sadness in his eyes, a wariness that wasn't there before. The company that had once thrived on arrogance was now struggling to adapt. They had lost their edge, their authenticity, their moral compass. And in many ways, Chris was a reflection of that decay. One afternoon, during a joint meeting, a senior executive from Linton and Marks mentioned the firm's declining reputation. Clients were leaving. Reviews were dropping. Their top investors were losing faith. When the call ended, Chris approached Aisha privately. His tone was softer than she had ever heard. He admitted that the company was in trouble, deeper trouble than anyone knew, and that her firm might be their only chance at survival. For a moment, she saw the irony clearly. Years ago, they had refused to hear her ideas, silenced her voice, and cast her aside. Now they needed that same voice to save them. That night, Aisha stayed in her office long after everyone else had gone. The rain tapped softly against the glass as she looked over the new proposal from Linton and Marks. They weren't just asking for marketing help anymore. They were seeking a merger, or more specifically, an acquisition. If she accepted, Aurora Strategies would gain controlling interest in the company that had once fired her. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the final line. Linton and Marks proposes a full acquisition under Aurora Strategies to be finalized upon approval by the board and CEO. It was poetic justice, years in the making. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. She could still hear their laughter from that first day echoing in her mind. But this time it no longer hurt. It only reminded her of how much stronger she had become. Aisha smiled faintly. The girl they had mocked was gone. The woman who had replaced her was unstoppable. The decision she would make next would not just change her life. It would change the legacy of everyone who had ever doubted her. The following morning dawned with the same heaviness as every pivotal turning point in life. Aisha sat alone in her office before sunrise, the city still cloaked in mist. On her desk lay two documents, one symbolizing the past, the other the future. One was her termination letter from years ago, printed on Linton and Marks' letterhead. The other was the proposed acquisition contract, stamped with Aurora Strategies' bold, gleaming logo. She looked between them for a long time, feeling the weight of everything she'd endured to reach this point. Every insult, every mocking laugh, every door slammed in her face. All had led here. It wasn't just a business decision. It was destiny knocking on the same door that had once been shut in her face. By mid-morning, her board gathered for an emergency session. The atmosphere was tense yet electric. Aisha presented the details of the acquisition with her usual calm confidence, outlining how Aurora Strategies could not only save Linton and Marks, but rebuild it into something ethical, inclusive, and forward-thinking. Her team listened intently. Most of them knew fragments of her backstory. The company that once rejected her now at her mercy, but they never imagined it would come full circle like this. When she finished, silence filled the room for a moment before her CFO spoke the words everyone was thinking. Let's buy them. The vote was unanimous. Within weeks, the process began. Legal teams exchanged paperwork. Financial analysts assessed valuations. And while the world outside saw this as a bold business move, Aisha knew it was something far deeper. It was a reclamation of power, of dignity, of identity. When news of the acquisition broke publicly, the industry buzzed with disbelief. Headlines flooded the media. Aurora Strategies acquires its former parent company. Immigrant CEO rewrites corporate history. The woman they laughed at now owns them. Aisha avoided the spotlight, focusing instead on the restructuring. She didn't want revenge to define her legacy. She wanted transformation to. The first time she returned to the Linton and Marks building after the acquisition, her heart raced in a way it hadn't in years. The marble floors were the same. The receptionist's desk hadn't changed. Even the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the hallways was identical. But the energy was different now. Every gaze followed her with a strange mix of awe and fear. Employees whispered her name with reverence. The immigrant girl, who once sat quietly at the end of the conference table, was now the one whose name would hang on the company's front door. In the main boardroom, the same one where she'd been humiliated years ago, Aisha stood before a table of familiar faces. Some of them had mocked her openly. Others had stayed silent, complicit in her pain. And now, every single one of them worked for her. She announced sweeping reforms, fair hiring practices, anti-discrimination training, mentorship programs for underrepresented voices, and pay transparency. For the first time in the company's history, diversity wasn't just a checkbox. It was a cornerstone. Not everyone welcomed the change. Chris Lambert, still clinging to his pride, resisted the transition. His tone was sharp in meetings, his frustration barely contained. He viewed Aisha's leadership as a threat, not an opportunity. But Aisha never lost her composure. She remembered how it felt to be small, to shrink under condescension, and she refused to repeat that cycle. She treated Chris with professionalism, never cruelty. And that, somehow, was harder for him to face. Weeks passed. Profits began to rise. The company's image slowly repaired itself. But beneath the surface, Chris's resentment simmered. One evening, he confronted her after a long meeting. Though she said nothing, his voice trembled with guilt and desperation. He admitted he couldn't handle reporting to her. That seeing her succeed was a mirror he couldn't bear to look into. Aisha looked at him, not with anger, but with something more powerful. Pity. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. His judgment had built the walls that once trapped her, but her success had torn them down completely. That night, she signed his resignation letter without hesitation. As months rolled by, the transformation of Linton and Marks, now renamed Aurora Global, became a global case study in ethical business reform. Former employees who had left due to discrimination reached out to thank her. Young professionals from immigrant backgrounds wrote letters saying her story inspired them to keep pushing forward, despite ridicule or rejection. But one message hit her harder than all the rest. It was an email from a teenage girl in Pakistan who wrote, "They tell me I sound funny when I speak English. But then I saw your story. Now I practice my accent proudly." Aisha read those words again and again, tears welling in her eyes. That was the real victory. Not the acquisition, not the profits, not the headlines. The real victory was breaking the cycle of shame and replacing it with pride. Yet, even as she felt fulfillment rising inside her, Aisha knew her journey wasn't fully over. The press began digging deeper into her story, uncovering every painful detail. Old coworkers resurfaced, trying to rewrite history, claiming they had always believed in her, that they had helped her along. The hypocrisy stung, but she ignored it. Still, there was one ghost from her past she couldn't ignore. Chris Lambert had vanished from the public eye after his resignation. But one morning, her assistant brought in a letter, handwritten slightly crumpled and signed with his name. Inside it read, "You taught me more through your silence than I could have learned through 1,000 apologies. I hope one day I can forgive myself the way you've forgiven me." Aisha placed the letter in her drawer, next to the old termination notice. It wasn't closure, not entirely, but it was a sign that sometimes karma didn't come as destruction. It came as awakening. Still, the world hadn't seen the final chapter of Aisha Rahman's story, because soon, something unexpected would challenge everything she had built, testing whether her forgiveness was as strong as her rise. And this time, it wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about legacy. Years later, the world had changed, and so had Aisha Rahman. Aurora Global had grown beyond anything she had imagined. What began as a dream of survival had turned into an empire of empowerment. Offices spanned continents, mentorship programs had lifted thousands from marginalized backgrounds into leadership positions, and her name had become a symbol of resilience, not revenge. But with success came responsibility and the unrelenting eyes of the world. Every decision she made was scrutinized. Every speech she gave was dissected. Yet Aisha carried herself with the same quiet grace she had always possessed, grounded in the memory of the girl who once sat trembling in an interview chair, mocked for her voice. That girl never truly left her. She lived in every young immigrant woman Aisha mentored, every struggling intern who came to her office for advice, and every classroom where she spoke about diversity and strength. One crisp autumn morning, Aisha was invited to speak at an international leadership conference. The event was to be hosted at her alma mater, the very university where her accent had first been ridiculed. As she stepped onto the familiar campus grounds, waves of memories flooded back. The whispers behind her back, the laughter that used to follow her down hallways, the professors who underestimated her simply because she sounded different. Now, the same university had banners hanging with her name printed in goldy. Keynote speaker, Aisha Rahman, CEO of Aurora Global. The irony wasn't lost on her. When she took the stage, the auditorium was packed. Cameras flashed, applause echoed, and students leaned forward, eager to absorb every word. She spoke of perseverance, of not letting others define one's worth, and of the strength it takes to forgive those who once broke you. She told them that success without empathy is hollow, that true victory comes when you rise high enough to lift others with you. Her speech went viral overnight, viewed millions of times online. Messages poured in from across the world, from teachers, students, immigrants, and even former bullies who now saw the error of their ways. But amidst all the praise, one message stood out. It came from an unfamiliar name, a young woman named Emily Lambert. Her message was brief. "My father used to work for you. His name was Chris. He passed away recently, but before he did, he told me that you were the one person who changed his life. He said you showed him what true leadership means. Thank you for forgiving him when he couldn't forgive himself." Aisha sat in silence after reading it, her hands trembling slightly. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to. Peace. Chris's letter years ago had been the beginning of his redemption, and now his daughter's words had closed the final chapter. Karma, it seemed, had completed its circle not through vengeance, but through understanding. In the following months, Aisha launched a new initiative, a scholarship program named The Voice Within. It was designed for students who were often dismissed or mocked because of their accents, the backgrounds, or identities. The program aimed to prove that brilliance comes in every tone, every dialect, every culture. Applications poured in from across the globe, from children of refugees, first-generation students, and those who had been told they'd never make it. And every time Aisha read one of their essays, she saw a reflection of her younger self, frightened, hopeful, defiant. The first award ceremony took place at Aurora Global's headquarters. Aisha stood on stage, surrounded by students and their families. The air was thick with emotion as one of the recipients, a shy Nigerian girl, took the microphone. Her accent was heavy, her words careful, but her voice was full of pride. She said that growing up, she was teased for how she spoke. But when she saw Aisha on television, speaking fearlessly in her own accent, she realized she didn't need to change. The audience rose in applause. Tears streamed down faces. And in that moment, Aisha knew this was her true legacy. After the event, as the crowd dispersed, Aisha walked into her office, the same one that overlooked the skyline of the city that had once rejected her. She stood by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson. On her desk were two framed papers, her original rejection letter from Linton & Marks and the certificate of ownership from Aurora Global's acquisition. Side by side, they told the story of her life, from humiliation to triumph, from isolation to influence. But she didn't see them as symbols of revenge anymore. To her, they were reminders of how pain can plant the seeds of greatness, of how prejudice can become a teacher, and of how forgiveness can free even the heaviest heart. As the city lights flickered on, Aisha closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The laughter that once haunted her was gone, replaced by the hum of a world she had changed. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was her assistant, reminding her of tomorrow's meeting with new scholarship applicants. She smiled softly, replying that she wouldn't miss it for the world. Because now, her mission wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving to others like her that they were always right. Right to dream, right to speak, right to exist proudly as they are. And so, as night settled over the city, Aisha Rahman, the woman they once mocked for her accent, stood tall as the voice of a generation that refused to be silenced. Her story wasn't just one of success. It was a story of transformation. A story of a woman who turned laughter into legacy. A story of poetic justice wrapped not in revenge but in grace.